hosts, Aidan Campbell
and Joanna Wells.
In today's episode, we're going to salute that time-honoured Aussie tradition of having a cigarette break. I think it's called a Doorie or a Dura, but maybe I'm exposing myself as not Aussie enough. But you know what we're talking about.
Yeah, we thought it'd be a good topic to discuss, especially with fairly recent tax increases to cigarettes and the subsequent price rises that cigarette companies have been enforcing since 2020. Now, both of the tax and the price rises have been pretty substantial. I think over the last 8 or so years, the tax increases have been in 12.5% increments over 8 years, which is huge. So pretty much most of the cigarette people are smoking is largely taxed. I'd say well over 50% now. And as a consequence, cigarette companies have had to raise prices. So now we see massive price market positioning, as well as new tactical plays in the market to encourage new smokers to smoke, as older smokers maybe give up or die.
Yeah, when you start thinking about the cigarette industry, it's a pretty unusual and challenging industry in many regards. We're going to completely ignore in this episode purely for convenience the moral aspects of it, etc. Some people are obviously very against cigarettes, but we're going to use the example of selling, marketing, the value, etc., of cigarettes if you work in that industry. For ways you can think about your own industry, whatever it is. When you sell, cigarettes obviously were, I suppose, in the Western world and most developed and developing nations, built a huge percentage of the population, probably was certainly over 50% of the adult population were smokers at some point in the 50s and 60s, has declined since that, but clearly, it's still a large number, but it faces an awful lot of issues. So, in this episode, we'll kick around some ideas about how do you market that product, what is the value of it, the elasticities regarding cigarettes, and and what is the actual business model really in cigarettes now, and is it what we think it is?
So we all think of, cigarettes as being a very inelastic product. But since, subsequent price rises, what companies are finding now is that some customer segments are much more elastic, and that those segments tend to be the ones that are either sort of giving up, and the huge price increase in tax added to the cigarette is just a great encouragement to do that quickly. So it's accelerated, people giving up in those segments. However, what the cigarette industry are also finding is that in certain subsegments, and these happen to be in the more socially deprived segments, cigarette consumption is still inelastic. So it doesn't actually matter how much the price goes up and tax is added. Those segments are still consuming cigarettes.
Yeah, we could be getting into the classic economic concept here of the Giffen good, whereby it's a reverse taxation almost, where it potentially is hitting the lower economic income people more than the higher income. But there is an aspect where people are prepared to buy that product even as the price increases. It could be that it's an affordable luxury, even given the pricing where it is now, which I think in Australia is roughly around $40 per the 20 cigarette pack. So it is very expensive, especially if you're a 20 a day smoker or even more. So it really does add up. But maybe it's one of those affordable luxuries that still falls into that category and that people want. It is inelastic, and that's obviously the reason why people put a huge amount of taxation on it. But I suppose the other thing, it's inelastic, but not particularly, the product themselves. You can't swap from one brand of cigarette to another, because in reality, when the tax is applied, all are lifted at the same level. So, you're not going to shop around for the cheaper one to a large extent. It's either do you make the life-altering decision that really is a medical choice to a large extent of quitting cigarettes.
Well, this is actually a really interesting point, Aidan, because since the price increases and the taxes were added, cigarette companies are actually finding people to be less brand loyal than they ever have been. So, say even about 10 years ago, people really wouldn't consider swapping brands based on price. They'd be quite loyal to the brand. There'd be Marlboro smokers, there'd be Embassy smokers, you name it. They would stick to that brand because they know it. However, since 2020, there's been much more brand swapping, changing, and even changing the type of cigarette to, it could be vaping now, or people will be prepared to switch towards the end of the month when their budget runs out to, loose cigarettes, roll your own tobacco cigarettes, simply to, I suppose, aid the addiction and to keep in line with the budget. They can't afford the brands that they wanted, so they have to, downgrade. So what's cigarette companies and the government's response to this new behaviour? Well, initially tax was imposed on, the traditional cigarette, but now the massive tax has been applied across the board to roll your own tobacco cigarettes, because this is where the market's moved. Mm-hmm. So what cigarette companies are doing now are really thinking about, almost like choice modelling across a month to see, how customers, because customers are consuming different varieties of cigarettes and tobacco to aid their addiction. So companies now are thinking about how they can accommodate changing preferences across a month too. So really, the interesting thing here is that now more than ever, cigarette companies are tracking consumption, because before they could just guarantee that people would smoke a certain brand in a certain way. Now people are changing preferences, and even across a month, when they get their money to when the money runs out towards the end of the month. So this is a really interesting point.
Yeah, I think, we've touched on a couple of topics there. I suppose one, maybe marketers would know more about this. There's obviously the value of the brands potentially could be decreasing as marketing and imagery, which used to be so important for cigarettes, has really decreased. Items such as the Marlboro Man and certainly Rothmans and people like that who used to advertise at Formula One races. So it was always very a visual aspect, and even people old enough to remember cigarette ads on TV, they did sell that lifestyle of being cool, independent, whatever, whether it's a cowboy or whatever it was, or motor racing. So that is decreasing. It certainly has decreased over the last X number of years, and so potentially that might be driving swapping between different brands. One other thing I would say is, due to COVID, clearly, well, certainly in Australia, international travel has massively decreased, almost to zero, and so duty-free shopping will also have hit almost zero. So a lot of people would have taken advantage years gone by of the duty-free shop to get those, the cartons, the 40 packs or whatever it was, that would have topped them up throughout the year. And also in duty-free shops, you'll always notice that the visuals behind the marketing and the branding is much stronger. You can still see the packaging in nearly all those locations, which is now something, a heritage aspect almost in Australia. So yeah, that was just two topics I'd make on that. I suppose the other thing I'd say about cigarettes, we always talk about it as an addiction, but people have many addictions, whether it's gambling, whether it's alcohol, whether it's spending all your money on a sporting team that you love. So, some people just really enjoy cigarettes, and we can never dismiss that. And so they enjoy them, they enjoy a flavour, they enjoy the feeling it gives them. It could even be the attitude, it makes them think more at certain times. And so there's those aspects that people value. That's a value driver that people have. And one thing I even noticed recently when doing a bit of research for this podcast, you can buy cigarettes online now, and online you still see the packaging a little bit more, and there is still that exotic aspect to certain brands, Davidoff and some of the French brands, and the international brands, a bit like international beers, where people, maybe it reminds them of holidays or when they were younger, or those sort of aspects. So branding probably still is the flavour. Those things really they play on the mind, and that's strong for marketers. I remember reading that smell is a big thing to help people remember things, and if you smell a certain smell, whether it's cooking or coffee or whatever it is, it can bring you back to a time and a place. And let's be honest, cigarettes certainly smell.
So in terms of branding, cigarette companies have found that the packet itself, the design, the brand, the colours used is still the number one driver of purchase. But the problem remains, just on that, I suppose, and the number one brand that most people, even still today, recall when asked, is Marlboro. Marlboro is still the number one brand. It has the greatest brand presence of all brands. But the problem really, even for Philip Morris and those major corporations, is that in one of the main channels to market, supermarkets is the number one. Supermarkets aren't legally allowed to show the cigarette packets. They're locked up in a cupboard. You can't see it. And then when the cashier opens up the cupboard, or you just see those horrible images of rotting teeth or cancers and stuff that's really unappealing. Nothing quite like the brand positioning and the brand image that the companies actually want to show potential customers. It actually is there to put new customers off, and for existing customers that are used to smoking, that has been shown not to put customers off, showing those diseases and bad teeth. They're just because they're addicted. That's what they're going to continue to do that. And equally with the price points, it's very difficult to track as a consumer the changes in prices. Because they're in a cupboard, or you can't see the differences. So very often, and legally speaking, different cigarettes can't compete with competitor brands, and often they end up competing with their own brands if they start doing any pricing changes anyway. So week by week, what actually happens are two things. There are new channels to market because existing channels to market can't promote brand, and brand is the number one driver of purchase. So they're using online avenues that are highly, I suppose, unregulated compared to more traditional channels to market. It's much harder to track changes online than it is in store. The next point is, unlike any time before, cigarette companies are using both price positioning, changing price increases, and also tactical discounting on a weekly basis. It's not as fixed as it used to be. There's much more activity in the pricing. However, the price range within which they're discounting is very, very tight. It's almost like between $25 and $27, and if you go below and above, this causes a below margin loss, unnecessarily margin loss, and above people switch to cheaper brands. The cheapest brand being about $30, and the optimal price point is around $50 for a pack of 25 cigarettes. So there's a lot of different revenues plays in the market, but the essential one that's really driving strategy at the moment is how can multinational cigarette companies acquire new customers. This is where the new business is. And what's happening, it's through online, through promotions, subtle promotions, through social influencers. If you look into it a bit more, you'll see that a lot of social influencers actually smoke. And some of these social influencers have, to some degree, some alliance with cigarette companies. Now, that is a great way to promote a brand. It looks cool. Think about 1930s cinema. How they glamorized the cigarette. The same things occurring online, and young people are being exposed to these sort of images and associating smoking with it being cool. The second thing is that they're actually branching out into developing economies, countries, Africa, India, China, where they're still highly unregulated. It's still possible to show the Marlboro man looking cool on a billboard. That's all okay. So whole populations are being exposed to those sort of promotions as the US, UK, Australia were many years ago. So the same tactics are being played, just in a different way.
Yeah, one thing I'll say I think about cigarettes is I suppose there's been so much push on stopping people from having them. So much drive has been based around you can't smoke, you can't advertise. There's even been situations where in certain countries they've gone back and, with technology removed those movie stars and the cigarettes they used to smoke and, made it look as if it was all clean. I'd even say, like in a Hollywood movie nowadays, it would be more socially acceptable to see a scene with someone taking heroin than taking, having a few Marlboro with the brand visible. So that's how far things have changed. One thing I'd say is with all this pushback, I would say now that there's a lot of people are sick of this. They're sick of being told what to do, and a certain category of people will always want to, rebel against that. So cigarettes are seen as a tool of rebellion. Was it Torches of Liberty was the Edward Bernays advert back in the 20s to encourage women to smoke at that point in time. So they've always had that image. And I would really think, certainly in 2021, an awful lot of people just want to tell government and medical people where to go. They feel every aspect of their life is being ruled, whether they agree or not agree with it. And so there'll be a certain percentage of people just have clocked out and just do not care anymore. So that's that. I think we've talked quite a bit in this podcast. One thing we wanted to talk a little bit about was what is the real business model now of tobacco companies, cigarette companies, in developed societies, in developed economies, where there are significant restrictions on selling tobacco. So say we take that packet, and I spoke to somebody who works in a major tobacco company recently, and they described their business as fundamentally a tax collection, a license for tax collection, with the ability then to invest those funds in overnight deposits and investment accounts to make returns before they have to pay that tax to the government. So in theory, a $40 packet of cigarettes, let's say $35 of that is government duty, government taxation. They have the license to collect that money. They then have the ability to collect that money and hold it in their own company accounts for a period of time until they have to make payment to the government. And they employ quite a team of accountants and lawyers, etc., to ensure they maximise the financial return on those assets.
Yeah, and all the while, whilst that's happening, they're using price optimization to ensure that, smokers that loyal smokers that are going to smoke until they die are going to smoke at price points that are well optimized, that are revenue generating for businesses. And then there's that new business strategy that I mentioned as well in developing countries, where they're going to keep pushing those new existing marketing strategies to acquire new customers to ensure the longevity of the cigarette industry, because essentially that is key to even the financing licensing model that Aidan was talking about. We still, the cigarette companies still need new customers to keep all of it running. So, the strategy in developing countries is actually very, very important to the businesses, cigarette companies globally. And there's even talk of, the major cigarette companies merging now to unite in light of these serious sort of business model challenges. Rather than competing with each other. Now, I don't know that may not ever happen, but there certainly is talk and options in motion at the moment to ensure that the cigarette industry remains.
Yeah, I think you can. The news in 2021, it's always confusing to look at. You can look at. I always think of when David Beckham, the famous soccer player, played for the Los Angeles Galaxy soccer team, and that club was sponsored by a marijuana company, and they were allowed to have that blazoned on their jersey, whereas putting a Marlboro or something like that on their shirt would have been completely unacceptable. So things change, trends do change. We hear how much the government cares about our health and well-being to the extent that they can lock us in our own homes. So we hear about that a lot. But it is strange that cigarettes, whereas there is a lot of evidence, let's be honest, a huge amount of evidence that they are a factor in causing cancer. But there's still, I don't think there's been a single developed country to actually ban the sale of them. So there's a lot of things. People make money from cigarettes, but fundamentally the people who make the most money are the government. I believe it was that the Czech Republic looked at banning cigarettes, and then their economists told them they could not afford that because the supposed excess healthcare costs and looking after cancer patients was much smaller than the actual revenue brought in from tax on the cigarettes themselves. So it's an interesting one, but it's the business of cigarettes. Fundamentally, selling the cigarettes is a lot of stuff right in the back of it, such as tax collection and other things.
And I believe that, in terms of tax collection, and Australia has the highest tax collection on cigarettes, and cigarettes in Australia are the highest priced in the world. So you can imagine, the revenues coming to both the cigarette industry companies and the government here are quite substantial. So, although the tax is purported to be used to stop people from smoking, in the segments it should, it's actually increasing demand. And what's actually happening is that the black market for cigarettes is increasing, and the hunt for new and young and more naive smokers is on the increase. So, again, is government intervention required here, or is it actually creating further problems that are more difficult to control?
Yeah, I think that's about it from me. Nothing more to add. So I hope everyone has a great weekend.
Yeah, thanks a lot.